When it comes to this idea of discipleship, we want to make sure we're measuring people that are on the journey. We're not measuring people that arrived at a destination.
Yeah. Ooh, there's the tweet for the day. There's the tweet, everybody.
Welcome to Divine Renovation's Missional Leadership Podcast. Here's your host, Tammy LeBlanc.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode. And as always, welcome to you, Matt, and welcome to you, Rob. Always great to see your faces on my screen.
Hey, Tammy, it's good to be here.
So the last time that, Rob, you and I met in person, it was staring each other down across the end of a very competitive ping pong table, if you might recall.
I do. I've tried to forget that, but I do remember it. Yes.
It was all in great fun. Great fun.
Especially when you're the winner. It's a lot of fun. We were at a common friend's house, and I think I lost to everybody, but I lost the worst to Tammy.
Tammy!
I never get to play, so that was kind of a fun thing. I don't even know over the years, the odd time I've picked up a paddle, I guess it's called, right? I don't even know the terminology.
You're making me feel better about my loss.
Matt, are you a ping pong player?
Did you say ping pong or beer pong? Just to be clear.
Are you a beer pong player?
No, my kids are still too young. But we love ping pong. We actually have a ping pong table in our garage because in Texas you can play 13 months out of the year because it's so warm.
Right. So guys, today we are talking about measurements. Now, I'm sure, when a lot of listeners are hearing this word, they're probably thinking, wah, wah, doesn't impact me. It's not part of my renewal journey. Why do we want to talk about measurements, and what role does it play in our renewal journeys?
Well, we started off the conversation with Tammy, you beating Rob in ping pong, so maybe we could set the stage. How many games did you beat him in ping pong, and what was the score?
Wow, he really wants to make you look bad, Rob.
Purely for example purposes, so you don't have to give the details of either of those things. But it is a great way to think about it, Matt.
Yeah, we already measure things in our lives, right? I mean, it's not like measuring's new. I mean, I think one of the ways I love it as a parent measuring is when we were in our old house, we had a wall where we'd put our kids up against and measure how tall they were. And that was actually one of the hardest things, I'm going to get choked up talking about it, was one of the hardest things to leave behind when we moved houses. So we took like a drawing of it, and the intention is we're going to try and put that in our house here. But now I think I haven't measured my kids in a while, and they're still growing, and I've stopped measuring. But like, there's ways we love measurements, and I think in the church maybe we think that that's not for the church, or it's not as important. Although, again, even in a church, right, we measure our finances, we measure attendance, we measure the number of sacraments we do.
And I think there's other things that we measure intuitively, because every time you decide to do something again or decide to not do something again, you're doing it for a reason, and some measurement has contributed to that. It's like, well, we're running this program. We've been running this program for 49 years since Father so-and-so was here and started it. And we continue to run and go, well, what's the measurement there? Well, the measurement is to keep things static. The measurement there is to keep people happy. The measurement, to avoid people being upset if we didn't do it, right? So that's a measurement, because that's influencing your decision, and that's influencing whether you're going to do it again, right? So I think the myth is as they're listening to us today thinking, well, I don't measure, or I don't want to measure. The fact of the matter is, I think you already do. Today's topic is really to get us to think back and reflect on what we're measuring, and to be more intentional about developing new habits or new practices around measuring.
Okay, so if we want to change our frame of mind then from what we are currently measuring to what we want to measure, what are we looking for?
Rob talks a lot about this. He's like the expert, resident expert, I feel like. I've learned a lot from him about measurement, just because it's easy growing up in the church and then working in a church. You just kind of get carried along with how we've always measured. And like the things you just mentioned, Rob, around like, we measure whether to continue a program or not. We have other ways of measuring success that might not be as practically tangible or a hard number. But I like just naming those things as measurements. Maybe you can pay more attention to them if you just name the other things you're looking for. And Rob can kind of speak to like, what we measure. We're looking for outcomes and fruitfulness.
We speak into the idea of forming a vision. We talk about the fact that the church has a mission. All of those are outcomes that we're supposed to be about and working towards and contributing. And so first of all, it's just, stepping back and asking, are we seeing those outcomes? Are we working towards those outcomes? But not just measuring the outcomes, but taking a step back and thinking through what's contributing to those outcomes or lack of outcomes. And so what are the steps? What are the processes, systems, things like that in the middle of all this that help us to think through? Because while there's certainly a spiritual dynamic with the Holy Spirit working, we don't always necessarily have the exact amount of outcomes we want or don't. There's always that piece that we're never going to fully define. It doesn't mean that we can't contribute and be intentional around the steps that contribute to the outcomes. So for example, we talk a lot about the idea of forming disciples. And so part of that we say is, well, when someone becomes a disciple, that's kind of an outcome. But to know how you're forming disciples, what are the steps that you're taking as a parish to help someone become a disciple? We talk about a discipleship pathway, and those are the steps that we want parishes to be intentional. Say, this is what a disciple looks like, and then work back from that. These are the steps that we want to help them take. And then just being aware of measuring each of those steps and being aware whether those steps are the right ones and whether it's happening or not, right? So there's kind of a number of things that kind of contribute to that moving forward. And we talk about the importance of having, a dynamic church, or a church that's alive, or a church that's active. And, a lot of those, we use a lot of different descriptors. So part of what we would say as well is understanding how your culture influences and affects your overall outcomes. And so culture is about relationships. It's about how people get treated, how leaders get treated, how leaders treat people who aren't leaders, and just stepping back and saying, okay, what's the environment, what's the culture that is going to best influence the steps and the outcomes that we want to take.
I'd love to throw lots of examples into this topic, because I know listeners in some cases, they want to be told, what do I need to measure? But I think what it boils down to is they really have to have their own definitions up front, or in terms of what their pathways are, what discipleship looks like in their context and whatnot. But let's start to break that down some more. So let's start with sacraments, because sacraments is something that the church is already doing. Rob, you have a great story of a priest that you coach, and you were asking him how his confirmation prep was going. Do you want to share that story, as it's going to highlight a bit around what the priest was measuring versus what he should have been measuring to be able to respond to that question?
Yeah, we were in a coaching call, and this has happened a few different ways with a few different churches. So it's not like a one-time event, but say what's been happening, kind of doing a bit of a check-in, and they said, yeah, we just had our confirmation. And say, well, how did it go? He goes, oh, it was great. And I was like, oh, cool. Well, tell me about it. And he starts explaining the process and the experience and all this sort of stuff. And I said, so can I ask you a question? He said, yeah. A month from now, how many of them that went through confirmation will be back? And he looked at me and he goes, oh, well, not very many. And I said, oh, but that's good in your mind. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, you just said your confirmation went really well. It was good. And I go, but he goes, well, no, that's not good. It's like, okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. And he was still a little bit kind of confused at what I was saying. It's like, so you have a system that you think is great, but it's not leading to the outcomes that you'd like to see, but you think that's good. And then it kind of clicked with him. As we kind of unpacked what he meant by good, is that it went smoothly. The details were there. Parents were communicated with, and the stuff that's important, you don't want people to not be communicated with, and you don't want it to not run smoothly. So it's not like that's unimportant, but that's not the most important aspect of why you're doing, kind of the whole process, right? Like, and when you think in terms of how you're forming people, and confirmation being such an important aspect of someone's spiritual growth, and then yet, the challenge that most people run into, confirmation isn't the beginning of their journey of faith. It's the graduation from their faith. And, and so the question is, how do you kind of turn that on its head? The outcome, right? How many people are or coming back, the steps, what is actually contributing to your confirmation process that's affecting the results you're getting or not getting. And then culture, what's the environment that people are experiencing these things in as they're going through the process of it, right? And just being aware of each of those dynamics.
Can we break down that last comment a bit more around the culture that the participants are experiencing it in? What kind of measurements are we thinking we could look at that would give us a sense of culture? Like that kind of leads us down this pathway. I'm thinking of qualitative versus quantitative measurements. So we want to maybe open that up a little.
What's the culture of the parish? What's the assumption that is made, right? And the assumption is that, people who have no connection to the parish are going to show up. They're going to have this experience to go through confirmation. Everybody's grandmother is going to be happy and nobody's going to complain. And then they'll move forward. And a lot of times the environment for confirmation it's a classroom. It's just downloading information, things along those lines. And so to step back and say, okay, at the beginning point, do people really know what confirmation is about? And are we journeying with them? Are we creating more of a relational atmosphere? And what's confirmation about? Confirmation is about a relationship with Jesus. And yet we're going to do it in a non-relational environment and hope that they value a relationship in a non-relational environment. But then on top of that, it's like, okay, do they really know what confirmation is? And have they truly had that experience of faith and understand that we are speaking about what it looks like to walk with Jesus? And so are we communicating that aspect to them? Are we modeling that aspect to them? And again, are we willing to, and this is the important part of creating a healthy culture and creating positive outcomes. And this will seem counterintuitive to people. Are we willing to look at people and say, no, you're not ready for this, or you're not at the point of what confirmation is for, right? Because it has to be something and it has to mean something. And if you're not measuring that, and if you're not developing an environment that helps people take the steps into that, then it's not going to become that, right? And that will seem hard and challenging to a lot of people. But the churches that are willing to create those are kind of willing to create that filter and measure it that way are actually the churches that have the most impact for confirmation and for people that go through the process.
Since you stole all the information about youth ministry and confirmation, I'll pick another sacrament. I think the same thing comes like in an RCIA process, right? We see RCIA process is onboarding new parishioners. Like somehow we're going to take the people that are maybe coming to Mass with a loved one or going through some sort of, there's all kinds of ways people come to RCIA, but sometimes it's coming through some sort of irregular relationship or trying to get that square with the church or wanting to get married in the church. Some come back to faith, but I bet if we're real honest, since we don't measure this, how many are new to faith? Like how many times we'll see during Lent that the candidates, the confirmandi, all of those that are exploring joining the church get up during Mass and leave. Well, a lot of times it's like family units or little kids that have just like getting caught up on their sacraments rather than it measuring new followers of Jesus. How many people are new to faith? So instead, we just take them all as one lot, throw them in a classroom, measure how many are there, measure that they've completed all the steps, measure they've turned in all their paperwork, they go through everything, and success at RCIA is how many baptisms and confirmations at the Easter Vigil. And for most RCIA programs, that's the end of the journey. I know we have this piece of it, the Mystagogia piece, where it's the like, now what? But I would say, if we're really honest, the outcome we're measuring in RCIA is how many got to the Easter Vigil. Not where are they now, right? How are they being accompanied? How are they growing in discipleship? So we somehow cranked out a new Catholic and they're on the rolls as a parishioner, but how are they now growing in faith, exploring, maybe they explored who Jesus was to them in RCIA, but maybe not, because if we just get into the mechanics of here's the sacraments you're going to receive, here's what that says, let us teach you some stuff. And here, Rob mentioned the environment. One easy way that you can start to look at the way you do sacraments is the environment, the setting that you have them in. Now I get heartburn when I walk into a community center to see, like, tonight is night one of baptism prep class, or tonight is night one of RCIA enrollment. We even use like classroom words, class and, whatever. And you walk into the room and it's rows of chairs and one microphone at the front. That sounds so inspiring. I can't wait to go listen to someone tell me all the things I have to do and send me on my way. Like, give me some homework and go. Like, the environment itself says, I'm going to tell you what we value. So if you want to look at what you value, look at how you run your processes. Look at the environment. Look at who you're putting in the front of the room. Look what you're asking of them afterwards. That tells them what you value. And I bet it's not saying all the things we wish we valued.
I'm hearing what you guys are saying around qualitative, and I'm understanding the benefit, but I want to go even deeper, maybe with some examples of what that looks like. So meaning, we talked about, did we accompany them well? Was it a welcoming environment? How do you measure stuff like that?
Yeah, and I think, let me pull back a little bit. Like, as we're talking about this, every time you talk about an idea, it can sound, in some ways simple. But the fact is that this is really challenging, because you need a lot of kind of conversation on the front end and intentionality on the front end, rather than pastor, priest, or ministry leader walking in and say, today we're measuring, and this is how we're measuring, right?
Yeah.
You said earlier, Tammy, the qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative is numbers, amounts. Those tend to be a little bit easier to measure. The qualitative is it's more subjective. And I think we can fall into a couple different categories with that. Is like, well, it's subjective. We can't know anything about it, and we just have to kind of trust the results to God. Or we can go to the other end of obsessing and making this kind of a scientific exact process of this. And it's somewhere in the middle of this. This is something where there needs to be conversation about. Qualitative research is kind of something that you both have a sense of, you're able to discern it, but you're also letting it influence your discernment, right? So there's kind of this circular process. So when you're sitting down and you're saying, whether it's a sacramental process or whether it's some spiritual growth, development process that you have, small groups, Bible studies, alpha, whatever the thing is, right? It takes a group of leaders of saying, okay, when it comes to these things, what do we want for people? And how, as leaders, what are some indicators we'll know that that's happening? So let's take small groups, Bible studies, connect groups, whatever sort of smaller spiritual growth environments churches might have. We can go to the quantitative. How many people are in small groups? Okay, so we've got 20 small groups that average 8 people each. We'll say something along those lines. So that's the quantitative. Well, then the qualitative is, okay, well, what do we want them to experience in that group? How are we actually going to know that they're growing spiritually, that they're changing, that there's transformation? And I might have an idea, and Matt, you might have an idea, Tammy, you might have an idea, but let's come together as a leadership team and say, okay, how openly do people talk about their faith in groups? How comfortable are people to pray in the group? Do people share stories of sharing their faith outside of the group? What are the actual habits, spiritual habits of prayer, scripture reading, other spiritual habits that people are regularly participating in? And this is where it's a bit of a journey, because initially when you do this, you'll come up with 932 different ways that you could measure whether people are growing spiritually or not. But you got to get it down to a handful of 3, 4, 5, maybe at the most, indicators that you're going to measure to know whether spiritual growth is happening or not. Just kind of a few things like that you could measure in the context of a small group or Bible study, things along those lines, to give you an indication as to what the atmosphere, environment, or the qualitative measurements are that you're looking for that group.
Okay, it's starting to come around and make sense to me. Is it something that, okay, when I'm getting really practical here now, but do you want to eventually turn those stories into numbers? Meaning, like, are we looking to put a scale against that qualitative measurement to turn it into a quantity? So, like, when you ask the question, do people talk about their faith or share their faith with others afterwards? Are you trying to put that on a scale then so that you have a record and now all of a sudden you have a measurement that you can use?
I would say only if it serves you. I mean, everything doesn't have to be turned into a number.
Okay.
But it can, right? Like, I mean, you can say in Alpha this year, this many people said they were praying regularly. You can take that qualitative kind of measurement and give it a quantitative number if you want, but only if it helps you. This isn't for the sake of just measuring things, right? It's to share the stories to show growth and impact. So I think what's just as important, like Rob talks about stories are concrete examples of how someone grew in their faith. Now, it's very personal and it's individual for that person, but you can measure that, like start telling lots of stories, right? It doesn't mean now we have to go, well, we have 9 stories to tell you. Like, we can prove things out by showing we value them without it having to have a specific number. But I challenge you, there are certain things you're saying that need a specific number as well. But I would say telling a story is a concrete example of a qualitative measurement. And if you can normalize that and get people doing it, then see what happens is that becomes cultural. People are expecting to come out of Alpha and have a story to tell because they've heard other people tell stories and now they're telling their story. So that's how it assists in the growth process, as opposed to, hey, we had 15 people at Alpha this year. That's great, but tell me about their experiences, Alpha. See, this is one way maybe to get real practical as well, is in our evaluations of things. When we evaluate, most of the time we ask things like, how did we do? How was the food? How was the temperature in the room? Did you like the presentations? On a scale of 1 to 10, how effective was the speaker? Some of that might be helpful, but that's really evaluating how we did. I want to evaluate how the Lord did with them, right? So this piece, it doesn't mean you throw one out for the other, but I do think we need to have a better balance of like asking questions like, where were you before you came to Alpha? Tell me some of the experience you had at Alpha. I'm just using Alpha as an example. Tell me some experiences you had at Alpha that were profound for you. What were those kind of moments of faith? Tell me where you are now. Tell me where you're going next. And if you think about all those things I just mentioned, that's the backbone for telling a story.
Each leadership group needs to decide what data they want, they need, and how useful it is. So, step back and say, if we're going to measure the outcomes of our small group and we're going to turn it into a survey and into qualitative data, you can do that. And, there may be some value in turning that and celebrating it in the parish, or reporting to the parish how effective groups are, or reporting to, the leadership team, or things along those lines. But part of what you also want the data for is say, okay, we're about making disciples. And are we seeing disciples being made or not? And then looking back and stepping out, well, what's happening in our groups? To make small group leadership easy for people, it's good to make it measurable. Like, what 3 things do you want small group leaders to do? And are they 3 easy things that they can figure out where they can come out of a group and say, yeah, tonight went well because everybody shared, everybody prayed, and everybody brought a snack to share. I don't know, whatever.
In that order too, right?
Yeah, in that order, right? But then they can walk away and go, well, everybody prayed, but, or everybody shared, but not everybody prayed, or everybody, and they can, it kind of gives them something to kind of go by, rather, well, we showed up and we did a bunch of stuff and we hope the Lord blesses it, kind of a thing, right? And it gives them a sense of ability to know whether they're winning or not. Everybody likes to win, right? And particularly with, and I'm going on a tangent here, so Nathan can edit this out. Small group leadership can be very lonely sometimes. And people just show up and they do the same thing. They don't know if they're contributing. They don't know if there's any positive outcomes coming along those lines. And so that's one small way to empower them to know if they're making a difference. Because a lot of times leadership is very discouraging and people walk away not thinking they've made a difference. And so showing them, I think, some easy, tangible ways that gives them real-time feedback as to how they're doing and can adapt or adjust or go look for help from someone else because, hey, I'm not seeing this in my group. That's a way to encourage leaders, and that's a way to help leaders lead longer in a little bit more healthy way.
Okay, let's talk about discipleship. I think that is.
I don't get that Tammy's believing all of this.
No, actually,
she sounds so skeptical.
No, it's good. This is all starting to come together, and I'm having a greater appreciation for the qualitative, because for me, quantitative just comes naturally, and like we talked about, parishes are doing it anyway. But it's this qualitative.
Well, I think quantitative comes more natural to everybody. It's easier to know if you got 7 or 8 or whatever it is, and but I think qualitative is actually what impacts people more. And I think it's the qualitative when we understand that, I think that has the power to really contribute to changing a parish around. Because when you're working towards those things and you get people on the same page of it, I think that has the potential of really developing your impact more.
I think the light bulb there for me was the struggle was trying to understand how to capture that. But what I'm hearing you saying is it's about stories. It's about that relationship and those conversations. So you need to start asking the right questions of people and of the experience to know whether or not it's impactful.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
This isn't an exact science, but it is something that you can get more information around. And that's where it's like, okay, well, I'm leading a ministry with X number of people, and 2/3 of the people have had this experience, 1/3 has had this experience. You can turn that into quantitative data, like a survey. That's what a survey is. A survey is asking people their experience, getting them to rate it, and then you're kind of quantifying their qualitative experience in that, what they've personally experienced. You can listen to stories and say, okay, well, 7 out of 10 people, this was their story. So there's a place to combine those things. But again, I think this is where leaders have to step in and ask the question, how much information do I need to discern, to know the direction, to know the effectiveness of it? And then do I need to capture that in a more detailed way for other purposes?
It's making me look at that post-alpha team meeting differently. Because, so for those that haven't run alpha, the team meets at the end of the session after they've done small group breakouts, and they talk about what the highs were, what the lows were, like what went well, what didn't work so well. And I'll admit, I've been in those before and thinking, oh, why are we doing this? I just got to get home. And we get in there and everybody's like, yeah, it was perfect. It's good. Everybody shared it. And so what's the point of that? But you're giving me a new lens to look at that meeting and really start to maybe push the people that are saying, yeah, it went well, to explain a bit more, right? Okay, what does that mean it went well? And yeah.
Sounds like a coach, Tammy. You're doing good.
Oh, you guys going to make a coach out of me yet? Okay, so something that a lot of parishes, I think, are struggling with is measuring discipleship. So where do they begin?
So I think it's important to understand what a disciple is first. And that might sound like, duh, of course, we all know what a disciple is. But I bet right now, if we asked everybody in the chat to just put in there, what's the definition of a disciple? We would get as many answers as there were responses. Everybody'd have their own angle on it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. There'd be some similarities, right? Hopefully we'd go back to scripture and to Jesus. But I think to get clear around discipleship then helps us measure how we're doing at making disciples and forming disciples. I mean, they're kind of 2 steps there. And I think that's important for us because, if everything's discipleship, then nothing is really discipleship. Or if everything's discipleship, then we can't really measure how we're doing. So at my parish, we just came up with a simple definition and it had 7 indicators. You could argue that this is not the best 7 or there's 12 or we narrowed it down to 3. But here, I'll just give our definition. We said disciples habitually, and I stopped there because habitually goes with all 7 of these indicators. We don't consider someone a disciple because they turned up at Mass one time, let's say. But disciples habitually worship, grow, serve, give, share their faith, live virtuously, and build community. And if we have those 7 indicators, this actually helps us start to measure. How are we doing in each of these areas? And can we create some measurements around this? Now, this is done for a couple reasons, because discipleship isn't a once and done thing, right? We want to make them and we want to form them, and we need disciples to make other disciples. So even your disciple makers can look at these 7 indicators and see, how am I doing in this area? Maybe I'm 7 out of 10. How am I doing in this area? Probably a 1 out of 10. So it gives you an indication of maybe how well you're doing, where you need to grow, where you need to be mentored. And for the people that we're accompanying on this journey, are they disciples yet? Which areas are they doing well? Can we point that out to them? Can we point out the areas that maybe we want them to help accompany them and grow in that area? So I just think understanding even the term discipleship and getting clear around it can help us set up some measurements to see, are we making them, meaning there was a time when they were not? Are we forming them from the time we made them to helping them grow deeper in their faith? And then the journey continues from there.
I love that, Matt. And even in the midst of that, getting back to the quantitative, qualitative, there are things that you can easily measure, quantitatively in that. How many are serving? If you're serving or not. But then you get into, like you talked about, being virtuous. Well, that's a very subjective thing. That's a very challenging thing to measure that. But again, like, this is where I'd go back and say, well, that's too hard to measure. But in Galatians, it talks about the fruit of the Spirit. St. Paul put that in there because he expected people to recognize the importance of that and to identify those characteristics being in our lives or not being in our lives. So Scripture speaks very much about qualitative measurements in the life of disciples, right? So I think we have to wrestle with those aspects very intentionally and help our people and our leaders and normalize conversations. And when it comes to this idea of discipleship, we want to make sure we're measuring people that are on the journey. We're not measuring people that arrived at a destination.
Yeah. Ooh, there's the tweet for the day. There's the tweet, everybody.
Because this is a lifelong journey. We can stop measuring when we hit perfection, right? But until then, this has to be something we have to be intentional about and wrestle through. I would say as well, this is where it's so important to be in community with other people, because sometimes with those qualitative measures, we like to beat ourselves up and we like to say, well, I'm not perfect and I'm not doing, but to have other people that you're in relationship with that can speak into those things, say, Tammy, I know right now you're feeling guilty, you're beating yourself up, or you only see what you're not doing. But hey, let me share with you what I've seen happen in your life over the last, year. Matt, 3 months ago, Matt, when you worked through that forgiveness issue, whatever the case is, because we'll do these things and we'll not be aware of it and others around us. And so this is where I think measuring and having these conversations should be normal for all people in the context of parishes, and normal for all disciples to be thinking about these things. And again, that's a measurement.
And those are powerful conversations. I'm just imagining myself how fulfilling, I guess, it would be to have somebody speak that into myself. Yeah, it's a great idea for conversations. So I think that on the pathway to discipleship, it often starts with a conversion of heart, right? So yes, we're talking about different measurements that happen along the pathway, but at the beginning of it, there is something that changes in somebody's hearts. And I know a lot of parishes have been wrestling with, how do we measure that point? So what are some of the examples that you guys are seeing there?
Yeah, there's a great article, and we can put this in the notes, or however that works, but it's by Dan Spader. It's on disciple making, how to measure disciple making. And it says like a 50-page PDF document where he goes through kind of some stages. And he talks about conversion, service, reproduction, and multiplication. So, this is very scriptural. He follows it. It says, so the conversion step is where Jesus says, come and see. That's how he's inviting people to conversion. The service and how they start to grow as disciples is the follow me, act like me. And then the reproduction stage was follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. So sending them out to catch others. And then that multiplication stage is the go bear fruit, wild fruit, right? Like this cast widely. And so that might sound nice in principle, or it sounds like I'm about to do a Bible study, But he starts to lay out, Dan Spader starts to lay out those steps. Like I think in the Catholic Church, we're real good in that service area, right? Like how do we help people grow? We've got maybe some small groups. We've got Bible studies. We do, we're real good at class. And so we live there. But like you're saying, Tammy, how do we measure that first step, that come and see? And Dan Spader kind of lays out some questions that you could ask and how to measure that and how to capture some of that data to see if you're doing it. And I know Rob could probably speak to this because I love the way he says it as a Canadian when they talk about that day 50 days after Easter. So this is a way that we found in our ministry. And it doesn't have to be on this 50 days after Easter spot, but it's the way that we've kind of rallied around helping people understand how to start measuring that conversion point. Rob.
And you know, you're measuring how I'm going to say the word Pentecost.
Pentecost.
Yeah, I mean, at St. Benedict a number of years ago, we started wrestling through what this looked like. And so, yeah, on Pentecost Sunday, we started inviting people to recognize, and for all of our listeners, I would normally say Pentecost. And anyways, but
I know I've derailed the whole thing because every time he says that, they're going to be hanging up. Sorry, Rob.
It's insider jokes. Yeah. And so on Pentecost Sunday, we started measuring and putting out there, like how many people in the last year have had conversion to Jesus, where you maybe believed in him and had some religious practices, things like that, but you would really truly say that you hadn't trusted him, surrendered your life, or had a relationship with him. And different churches have done that different ways. Other churches have started doing that on Christ the King Sunday rather than Pentecost Sunday. Others will, try to get at that data at the end of their alpha. I think this is one of the areas for pastors that really truly want to see church renewal happen, where I think we're still very much on the front end of trying to figure some of these ways to measure, but these are some of the basic ways. And I just encourage pastors and church leaders to continue to lean into that and recognize that this is one of the truly most important things to measure in the context of their churches.
And I think as we talk about the Pentecost challenge, as that fear, I mean, you can do it on the 12th Sunday of ordinary time. You can do it at a daily whatever, but pick a Sunday and rally to it, right? And so what I love about it, and back to Tammy's kind of like where she's trying as a measurement queen right here. She loves measurement. She loves to get exact. So I'm not sure that's queen. She's an expert, let's call that. But because you don't have a queen in Canada.
Not anymore.
Specifically queen. No, we don't have a queen.
You don't have a queen. You don't have a queen. So back to the Pentecost challenge. In the Pentecost challenge, when we're trying to measure conversion, you're giving it a quantitative value by saying,
right.
However, like either stand up or fill out a card or tell us on a survey, how many of you this year have come to faith in Jesus? Or how many of you this year have had whatever thing is you're measuring? You're actually measuring it quantitatively based on a qualitative value of conversion.
Yeah. And it just in the midst of that, it's been funny reflecting on some of our experiences, and because in some contexts they'll try to narrow that in such a focused way to get an accurate measurement of conversion that nobody thinks they've had a conversion, and then in other places they try to widen it to where 3/4 of the parish responds because like it's and we're always like, what's a conversion, what's a step of faith or a step of spiritual growth, right? Trying to define the two. This is where I'd say it's more about asking the right questions and valuing the questions and always getting the data right. In the sense that, it's like, well, it is, and I'm not trying to say that the data, the information doesn't matter, but we value conversion, and this is what conversion is, and we're guiding our people towards that, and we're going to measure it. We're differentiating that between spiritual growth.
Right.
And we value spiritual growth. And so it's important to recognize the difference between the two and not get so wound up that you're always making sure, but did we have people coming forward saying they had conversions when they didn't? Or do we have people coming forward that are saying they had conversions when the reality was they had a conversion 3 years ago? And, that's where we have to not overanalyze too much and get too anal about the whole process. We have to recognize conversion is very important. Spiritual growth is very important. They're distinct things. We're going to try to measure them in a distinct way, but not always get so concerned and bent out of shape whether or not there's some overlap or some disconnect or things around those two things.
So can I just draw attention here to maybe the uncomfortableness or the awkwardness that some people may be receiving this idea of conversion? Because I'm thinking in the Catholic context, this word conversion can be uncomfortable. Did you guys kind of experience that sometimes?
Yeah, it's deeply personal, right? And everybody's different, and people feel they're not measuring up to the next person. So there's no way around it being uncomfortable. Here's the beautiful thing about being Catholic, though. We get to have ongoing conversion, too. So yes, like an initial moment of coming to faith matters. I mean, actually, it's interesting. We're talking about this right now because Pope Francis just talking on the baptism of the Lord during the season we just left. He said, "How many of you know your baptism date?" Well, most Catholics don't, right? But every time we go get another sacrament, we've got to get that baptism record. Or when we get married, we've got to know. Here, I'll just make an admission. I have all of my kids' baptism dates on my calendar. I didn't have mine. So last week, I went and dug up my baptismal certificate out of my fire safe, and I put it on my calendar. Because that date matters too. And for a Catholic, maybe that was as an infant, but that was that entry into the family of God, that moment of initial salvation. We should celebrate that moment too. But then on the journey, what are those moments of faith? And you don't have to say, well, maybe that was conversion, or it was like half of a conversion, or it was double conversion. Just make note of it. Like, those dates matter, and what happened to you in that moment matters. I was a youth minister for 20 years. I saw hundreds, probably thousands of conversions on retreats, right? Those moments need to be celebrated. Like, what happened on those retreats? Did you come to faith? We don't need to measure, well, did you do this 10 years ago? If your baptism counted, then this doesn't count. I think we're getting a little overly legalistic when it comes to some of that.
That's a great point. And can I say, I'm very impressed with your parents that they held on to your baptismal certificate to the point that they handed it down to you. Way to go, Mom and Dad. But
August 24th.
All right, let's put on our calendars, Rob, so we can congratulate Matt.
Party.
August 24th. But just leading more into that, the uncomfortableness, I think, and tying it into that example of the Pentecost challenge. I've heard priests say, like, that's uncomfortable to ask that question. And there's a fear associated with it because they don't want to be up at the front of the church asking about stories of changed lives and risking that nobody is going to step forward and acknowledge it, right?
I acknowledge all that for sure. We have to recognize faith is personal, but faith is not private. And so, we're called to acknowledge Jesus publicly. Jesus himself said, if you don't acknowledge me before men, I'll not acknowledge you before my Father in heaven. I think there's a place where we have to learn to normalize it. And again, the Pentecost challenge is one way we do this, right? It's not the only way. And so it's not this is the only way you're ever going to be able to measure conversion. Well, you don't want to do it, then, obviously it's your choice. We're not sitting here making you do it. The question is, how are you going to measure conversions then? And this is one way to do it. It's probably not the only way, and probably not even the best way, right? So, but there is this aspect to where we have to normalize our faith publicly. It gets back to discipleship, is if I'm never comfortable acknowledging my faith in the context of the church, how am I ever going to acknowledge my faith in the context of being outside the church, right? And again, you want to talk about how to measure, right? Who's comfortable discussing their faith in a church environment that isn't comfortable discussing their faith outside of a church environment, right? And so that could be, ways to think about steps. So the goal of this is to value measuring, to recognize measuring what's important, and how would you measure those things in the context of your parish. Mm-hmm. And also, too, every other church that does it, every pastor is scared to death before they do it as well. And we've heard stories of some pastors know people have had conversions, and they go to them ahead of time and, say, hey, will you make sure you stand up at that time, and they put some plants in and things like that. So, again, that's there's different ways to go. So it is scary. The discipleship journey is and growth is engaging fears and moving forward, and leading a parish is scary sometimes. Leading a parish for transformation is scary. So those in and of themselves shouldn't be reasons not to do it. But the ultimate goal is, are we valuing conversion and are we measuring conversions?
So guys, as we try to wrap up this conversation on measurements, what are some of the tools that parishes could use in this space?
Yeah, just a few around this. Like one, we didn't really go down the road too much, but I think, again, this is a measurement thing that can help us. Is really a leadership pipeline, is developing a strategy where you're going to measure your leaders at different capacities and abilities. I think that's a great conversation for churches to engage in. I think also there's some more formal tools. So, at St. Benedict and a number of other churches that are connected with us have used what's called the ME25 from Gallup. There's some cost to it, but it really gives you a lot of insight. And again, it measures one aspect. It measures what is parishioner engagement, and it gives you a lot of detail to help you see who's engaged, who isn't engaged, and it gives you a bunch of insight in that. Also, I coach, a few churches in Australia, and, down there they have a thing that's called the National Church Life Survey that they do within the churches. And again, this isn't anything we've promoted from our side of things, but they've done that. And again, it gives you a great kind of overview snapshot. That's, just kind of one tangible way that they can begin to start to measure some different aspects of church life.
There's a way that when we would start coaching parishes, we'd ask for their baseline metrics, and we'd send them, Tammy would probably know the exact number, probably off the top of her head, like 48 questions, right? And in those questions, we would measure different aspects of ministry, including collections and number of parishioners, but other things too, even about the age of some of the new of your members, or the number of people involved in ministries. There's other ways too to measure, kind of like our version of a starting point, like an ME25 might be. Another tool that we have a cohort we call Calibrate, where we involve pastors and their teams to come together around kind of a session cohort. We have Kickstart and we have Traction. Those are like cohort environments over a certain number of weeks or months. And Calibrate's one of those to help people understand some of the things we've talked about in this podcast, but to break them out a little bit more and to let them start seeing what it's like to measure. We even have a case study that we use in that cohort, which is a lot of fun to see what people come up with about how they would start to measure things like conversions and discipleship and people on this pathway of discipleship.
So that's actually a great tool or opportunity, I guess, for support that we can offer. If that is of interest to you, you can connect to our website at divinerenovation.org. We will also include the links for these other tools in our show notes. And we welcome all of your comments. We would love to know how this conversation has impacted you. As always, we pray that this conversation has been a blessing to you, our listeners, and we hope to see you on the next episode. Thanks, and God bless.